Welcome to Making an Impact. I'm Katie Mills, the head of Zygo Power at Schneider Electric, and in this podcast we meet incredible individuals from a range of industries to discuss the exciting projects they're involved with today, their career journey today, and ultimately what impact their work is having on the world. In this episode, we're making an impact with Megan Turner, Environment and Sustainability Manager at the Port of Dover, who's been at the port for over 3 years now. We'll discuss how the port is aiming to hit net zero and how being more sustainable has positively impacted their operations internally and externally. So welcome, Megan.
Thank you.
So today we're going to speak about the Port of Dover, the work that you do there, and realistically, the Port of Dover's strategy around sustainability. So talk us through that. What do your targets look like? What are you working towards right now?
Yeah, so for a really long time, we've kind of had an environmental policy that kind of delved into different sustainability topics. So we kind of had a loose target of, reducing our carbon footprint by 5% a year, but we never really had anything concrete until about 2021, when we really took a look at all of the data we'd been collecting and thought, well, are we in a place now where we know enough information that we can actually kind of give ourselves a really good route map of where we're going to end up, hopefully one day. So we sat down and looked at all that data. And we came up with a range of different targets that we published in 2022. So the first one is to be net zero for scope 1 and 2 by 2025, then adding in scope 3 for 2030, and then with our long-term goal to be a green corridor. Alongside that, in our sustainability strategy, we have a number of what we call target zeros. So those are our continual improvement targets that we never ending, keep doing every year. And there's a whole range of things in there. So there's zero waste to landfill, zero air pollution, zero pollution events into water, zero impact events, zero impact projects, those kind of things, really looking at how we can reduce our impact, not just from a carbon perspective, but along a whole host of things that we do at the port.
Awesome. And you mentioned green corridor. Mm-hmm. Explain to me, what's a green corridor? What does that mean in the context of the Port of Dover?
Yeah, so obviously the port does a lot of different things. We have a cruise terminal and a cargo terminal, but we're mainly known for that ferry terminal that does those Dover, Calais and Dover, Dunkirk routes. So to us, what that would look like, we'll be having Dover and then on the other side, Calais and Dunkirk, all the ports decarbonising themselves, as well as having, hopefully, a fully decarbonised crossing along that channel as well, so that you can get from Dover to France zero emission.
Okay, awesome. So 2025 net zero 1 and 2 goals, ambitious.
Yes, very ambitious.
Super ambitious. How's that going? What challenges have you faced and kind of how have you overcome them?
Yeah, so one of the reasons we were quite confident that although that's challenging, it's doable is we started recording and monitoring our carbon footprint in 2007. So we've got really a lot of data there, which is great. And when we started looking at this in about 2021, we'd made about a 60% reduction. So we'd done quite considerable work without really having a proper goal to get us there. So we kind of looked at what was left. What are our big things that are still causing us to have these emissions? And it was kind of our like diesel usage and like gas oil usage in like plant and machinery that you'd expect to find at ports, cranes, reach stackers, those kind of things, as well as our gas heating in some of our older buildings, and then all of the fuel we put in our own vessels. And so we kind of looked at what are the options to decarbonise all of those things, how quickly can we do those, and then how do we come up with 2025, and that's kind of how we worked that out. So we're actually at 96% down from 2007 so far, so we only have 4% left to go, which is brilliant. So some of the things we did is we transitioned as kind of like an immediate step all of our landside and our vessels to HVO, which is hydrotreated vegetable oil. So it's a waste oil, from things like McDonald's, I guess. Mm-hmm. And in doing that, we were able to massively reduce our emissions. We don't really see that as the long-term aim because there are better options than biofuels. It's not quite at zero emissions, but it was something we could do immediately with all the equipment that we had, and then our kind of processes that as and when that equipment would have naturally been replaced anyway, we then look at what is the actual net zero option for that piece of equipment. Is it hydrogen? Is it electric? Is it ammonia? Whatever that might be. So that has been a really huge help in bringing down those emissions immediately. We've also done lots of small things across the port, which when you add up across an entire port estate make a huge difference. So things you'd expect, LED lights, turning off aircon and computers at certain times of day. We've done lots of work around solar. So we have quite a bit of solar on site, I think 1.56 megawatts. as well as only buying our electricity that we need on top of the solar from renewable sources. That's helped a lot. Gas heating is kind of our last thing to go. We've been going through the buildings we can and taking out the gas heating and replacing it with a more sustainable source. But we have a few buildings that are listed structures, really special and old buildings, so it's a bit more tricky to replace their heating systems. And those are what's left of that 4% that we've got left to go. So we're working on that this year, obviously, and then in the start of next year, so that by the end of 2025, fingers crossed, we're looking like we're going to be on track to meet that target, which is really exciting.
Super awesome. Yeah. That's amazing to hear. So we speak about Scope 1 and Scope 2 under control, relatively speaking.
Yes.
Scope 3, how do you define that from a port perspective? Because obviously it's a very different scenario. What does that look like for the Port of Dover?
I mean, Scope 3 is massive, isn't it? Everyone is always talking about how much of a problem that is compared to Scope 1 and 2. We really use the greenhouse gas protocols to kind of figure out which of those categories are relevant to us, because not all of them are, and then which of our Scope 3 emissions fit into which category. So we've worked our way through all of them, and that's what we're using. So our biggest one, as I'm sure everyone always talks about, is purchase goods and services. We buy a lot of stuff as a port, both to keep it running, but also services. So it is looking a lot bigger than our Scope 1 and 2, which we were expected it to be. We already started on reducing Scope 3 without really knowing much about it, kind of in the last couple of years, by trying to make some sensible choices in our contracts and through our procurement policies. So we do have a sustainable procurement policy. We have been introducing those practices for a number of years before we really started recording Scope 3, because until last year we hadn't really looked at Scope 3 as a whole. We'd done bits of Scope 3, but not really going, okay, what's every single part of our emissions at Scope 3? What does that look like? Yeah, it's a huge challenge. We've made some improvements, but there's definitely still a lot more that we need to do before 2030.
And just getting your head around what is your Scope 3 is a massive task in itself, right?
Yeah.
Just collecting the data.
Massively difficult. When we started collecting that Scope 3 data, we did have to use a lot of those kind of government assumptions that you see where you spend X amount of money on, paper that's equals around this amount of emissions. But what we've been trying to do to combat that more recently, to get more accurate data, is kind of writing into our contracts that everyone's required to give us the data on either a monthly or a 6-monthly basis, depending on
their emissions data, ultimately.
Yes, exactly.
Right?
So that we can just get that data straight from them. We can have actual data rather than assumptions. But that has been really challenging, as I'm sure you can imagine. We have hundreds and hundreds of contractors and suppliers that, give us all sorts of different things. So really getting that through all of them is a process that we're still working on. We've obviously started with those contractors and suppliers that give us the main amount of stuff, and we're working down into those smaller ones. But it is massively challenging. It took us a whole year really to just get our first lot of data for 1 year to see what it looks like. Now we've got a process in place. Obviously that is speeding up a bit, but it has been one of the hardest things, is getting hold of that data. And what we have seen is, by now starting to get, in more recently this year, the accurate data from the suppliers themselves, how different it was from the assumptions. And in a lot of cases it is actually a lot lower, because we've been making those sustainable choices with our contractors. But until this year, getting hold of more accurate data has been almost impossible.
We, even at Schneider, I think we have something like 42,000 suppliers globally, trying to capture that data. And bear in mind, you're beginning, suppliers at all different stages of their own journeys,
exactly,
with their own carbon footprints. Some have got the data, some are still figuring it out. So yeah, it is a minefield, the carbon, the kind of Scope 3 piece. So can totally feel the challenges there. So when we speak about Scope 3, naturally for you guys, there is a big thing around, vessels.
Mm-hmm.
You're a port. Ultimately, you're there to transport people or goods, realistically, from A to B in some shape or form. How does that work? How do you work with the ferry companies or the cargo companies to work together from a decarbonisation perspective? And I suppose, what does decarbonisation look like from that perspective?
So I think from what it looks like is really different depending on which of our kind of vessel customers you're looking at. We have a really good relationship with all of our customers, which helps massively. But obviously getting everyone to share that data is a difficult thing. Everyone's quite sensitive over what they do and don't want to share. But I think what we've been really able to do more recently is kind of look at how explain to them how, if we can partnership on these things, we can decarbonise at a quicker rate. So we've been really fortunate to work really closely with our ferry operators on a number of different government-funded projects to actually figure out how doable being a green corridor is, for example. And in doing that, we have shared a lot of data and can understand how the port can play a role in that. So that's been really helpful. And we're quite fortunate as well that because almost all of our journeys are from the UK to the EU, we use a lot of the EU MRV regs. They have a portal where you can log in and see the emissions from all those vessels, which is really helpful as a port operator because you can log in and have a look at that. Obviously, since Brexit, it's a bit different if you're a UK to UK journey, but the UK government keeps saying that the UK version of that system will be coming out soon. So I think that's a really helpful tool for ports because they already have to report that data and it has to be made publicly available. So being able to access that and just knowing it exists is a really huge help. But it can be harder from some different sectors, I think, than others. I mean, for our ferries, for example, they have an idea and a quite a defined route that they're going down for decarbonisation, whereas for cruise and cargo, it's still a little bit more up in the air. There's still a lot of different possible fuels that it could be, and no one's really made kind of a strong commitment that which one it might be yet, which is a bit more challenging for the port because we don't know what we need to provide. So there's definitely, I think, different parts of the maritime sector at different stages of their journey, which is to be expected. But as a port, we need quite a lot more information from those different operators and what they're looking for to be able to provide that for them in the future.
And have you seen that, I suppose, rhetoric from those organisations shift in the last 5, 6, 7 years to being more focused around sustainability, what they can be doing, I suppose, electrification to some extent? How have you seen it, and kind of how have you seen that rhetoric shift a little bit?
Definitely, we've been really fortunate, I think, that because if I just talk about ferries for a second, because the route is very defined, it's 2 ports, and it isn't that far, it's only 28 nautical miles. It seems quite doable to a lot of people. So I feel like those ferry operators have been quite ahead of the game in looking at what options they are. I mean, we already have two of the largest hybrid ferries in the world on this route, which have reduced emissions from those specific journeys by about 40%. What it means is those ferries can both enter both ports and leave both ports fully emission free, which is brilliant from a kind of local air quality perspective as well as from an emission perspective. So we're already seeing that that's kind of moved forward a little bit further than maybe some of the other kind of ferry routes around the world and other industries, because it is more, I think, conceivable in people's minds that you could electrify that route. It's not that far. It is doable. So that's been really brilliant. They've been, if we think about when those vessels arrive versus when they were ordered, that is 7-8 years ago. So they, course, in the minds of some of our ferry operators, they have been having those discussions that long. I think definitely more recently we're seeing that really quite a lot in the cruise industry. We're getting a lot of requests for things like shore power, which is kind of seen as the most obvious way to decarbonise a cruise vessel. It obviously doesn't help with those propulsion emissions, but it helps quite drastically with those emissions at berth. And we're seeing a lot of requests from different cruise customers about when will we have that at the port and will they be able to use it, things like that, which is really great to see.
So that leads me on to the next challenge, right? Electrification.
Yes.
Power needs.
Yes.
What are you guys seeing? What are the challenges that you're facing right now with that?
So as I'm sure every industry in the UK is experiencing right now is grid constraints. It's massively holding us back at the minute. The port has a really, really small amount in comparison to what we need. So just throw some numbers in there. As a whole, the port has 7 megawatts that comes to the entire port estate, but that's split up into 3 different areas. So the ferry bit gets 4, the cargo bit in the centre gets 2, and the rest goes to the cruise industry. And they aren't connected, so we can't share that power across those. But looking at some kind of estimations and some mathematics of what it might look like, we're looking at possibly needing up to 162 megawatts.
So quite a big gap.
A massive gap for that kind of peak, if when all the ferries and we had cruises and everyone charging at the same time, which does happen quite frequently. So that's a huge gap. And as of many industries, we've approached the grid obviously to find out what we could have on what timescales. And I think ports by their nature are on the coast, obviously, and because of that, they're at the end of all the electrical networks in the UK. So it's definitely not a Dover-only problem; it's a port problem.
Yeah.
At many ports, there's almost, I think it's something like 80% of ports are electrically constrained, which really does harbour things like shore power, for example. With the ferry recharging, it's a bit newer. We don't know totally how we would do that because of the amount of power we need to transfer. But something like shore power, the technology exists right out there.
Yeah.
There's plenty of ports around the world that have it, not so many in the UK. It's not anything kind of innovative at this point. I don't think you could go out and buy the equipment and do that. But because we don't have the power in the port, we can't do that currently, which is something that we're really, really keen to overcome. But without kind of more support from the grid, it is quite tricky. As I mentioned, the port's installed quite a bit of solar on site. We're very physically space constrained. Anyone that's been down to the Port of Dover knows there's the White Cliffs on one side and there's the water on the other. There's no kind of more space that we could take up. There's no extra land that we could be using. So we're not far off like the peak amount of renewables we can make ourselves on site.
Yeah.
So that really leaves us to be reliable on energy made somewhere else, whether that's the grid or other renewable like locations outside of the port. But even there, all the ones that we know of, all the ones that are in planning are quite far away. So that makes that piece a little bit tricky.
Getting the kind of actual electricity to you is always a challenge, right?
Really, really big challenge. And then getting it across the port is going to be another huge challenge. You know, we're open 364 days of the year, 24/7. So it's not like we can, you know, close the port for a few weeks, dig it all up and put some cables in. We do have to do all of that while staying fully operational. And that is a huge challenge, because how do you dig up what will be the majority of the port to lay all of these cables to get them the energy not only just to the port but around the port to the right places?
Do you need help calculating and tracking your carbon emissions? Use Zygo Activate decarbonisation software to calculate Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, track your progress and reduce your carbon footprint. Search Zygo Activate and request your free demo today. Port of Dover is a trust.
Yes, trust port.
So technically speaking, investment that's needed to be able to upgrade infrastructure like that is not available to you guys, because you're not there to line, you know, investors' pockets or shareholders' pockets. You're there as a trust.
Yes.
How do you do it? How are you gonna I suppose fund it, shall we say?
Yeah, it's another one of the really, really big challenges for us, because we currently haven't got a defined way of funding this. As you said, we don't have shareholders where all the money goes, or that people can invest. So and we can take out loans like a normal business, but you need a pretty big loan to take out the kind of money we're talking to do this infrastructure. And we need to be able to show obviously the return to pay for that loan, and we don't currently know how that will work from a price point perspective. You know, the UK has some of the most expensive electricity in Europe, and that makes that tricky, because we do need to think about the fact that however much we all want to decarbonise, it can't be so costly that the actual route itself doesn't make sense anymore.
Yeah, of course.
So we do need to be able to provide that electricity once we've got it at a reasonable price that is affordable. Otherwise, the ticket prices go up far too high and nobody uses the route. So we have to be able to, if we're going to take out a loan, have that return on investment, which is quite tricky. I mean, the way that the UK grid works, obviously you have to pay quite a considerable amount of the reinforcement costs, just getting it to you, let alone the cost of getting it around the port. So yeah, we're still trying to figure that out at the minute. Is there a way for us to get some funding? I think I've quite often heard Schneider say that there's not a single shore power system in the world that hasn't had some sort of government funding.
Yeah.
We don't really have as many funding options for this available in the UK as you do in Europe, for example. And that does really hold us back if you look at the quantity of ports in Europe that have shore power or any sort of ferry recharging versus the same in the UK. Because it's a huge amount of emissions. We're very aware of that. I think it's 8% of UK maritime emissions is this Dover Calais route. And we really want to bring that down, but there is, we do need help in doing that from a funding perspective.
Yeah, and there's also, as you say, only so much within your direct control, where you're reliant on the grid to be upgraded.
Yes,
a lot of that's outside of your control right now.
Yeah, and the timescales for that don't currently really line up with the ambitions of our ferry operators,
as you would expect.
Yes,
as it's obviously going to need significant kind of government push and investment. I can understand that things take a bit longer from that perspective. So, like you say, difficult to align.
Very difficult.
Your priorities and their priorities as well. So great, you're going to upgrade your infrastructure. You're going to find out you're going to find funding to go and figure this all out, and then in 10 years' time, the technology changes. And all of a sudden, all that investment that you've ploughed into upgrading your systems in order to take on this extra power is now no longer needed. Mm-hmm. How do you factor that into your planning?
It's definitely a huge worry. I mean, even if we don't consider that a different fuel might, appear to be the better option in a few years, and if we just think it stays electricity, we know that battery technology will improve alone, and therefore, will there be a need to charge at both ends? There currently is, because of the size of batteries required, you'd have to charge at both ends, but one day you won't have to, you'll only have to charge at one end, and as I mentioned, France's electricity is much cheaper than ours, so surely they'd choose to charge just in France.
France, of course.
So how do we combat that? Because we can't spend hundreds of millions of pounds on something that we won't need in a few years. So I think for us, the only way to kind of get over that problem is to really work closely with those ferry operators and make it more of a partnership, and that we're doing this together, and have those kind of agreements in place that if we are going to invest this kind of money to help you on your decarbonisation journey as well, we do need some sort of guarantee that it's going to be used, because we can't have loads of redundant equipment in the UK for that.
Yeah, and naturally, like you say, if it's cheaper in France, they're going to charge in France. So we've got to be price competitive too.
Exactly,
right?
exactly.
So let's go wider.
Sustainability
as a port.
Yes.
What is included? Like, what do you have to think about as a port that maybe you don't? So let's think about the biodiversity piece, right? Very specific, I would say, to marine life in some way. What do you do with that? How do you deal with that? What are the things you have to take into consideration?
Yeah, so we have a really, really extensive kind of environmental monitoring program that covers biodiversity, but also things like water quality and air quality. We've had that in place since 1993, so again, a lot earlier than a lot of other places.
Yes.
And it's great from a data perspective. We have so much data, and we do all different surveys across the port so that we can then keep an eye on what's going on, but also then if we need to take action on something, we know how to do that. So we do water quality within the harbour. We also like to test the water quality outside of the harbour, because on either side of our harbour we do have marine conservation zones, so we like to make sure that we're not having any sort of detrimental impact on those conservation zones. And we also do water quality testing all up the river throughout the town of Dover that feeds into the harbour. One, so we can share that information with the council and the Environment Agency so they can be informed, but also, you know, that water is all ending up in the harbour at one point, so we can give ourselves that kind of pre-warning of what's happening. We do all sorts of air quality data, because air quality, especially from a local community perspective, is a really important issue. So we've done all different types of surveying in the past, and we recently bought a new bit of kit which is called a sniffer, and it attaches to a drone. We can fly that around the port, and it takes real live data that feeds back to us that we can kind of produce a heat map of what that might look like. And we'd like to expand those surveys into the town and onto the road network a bit more, so that we can again inform the community better of what's happening in our local area. But biodiversity is a really important piece for us. We really want to make sure that the port is kind of in harmony with the environment that we're in, and so we do all different environmental surveys ranging from birds and plants on the land to algae. We do benthic surveys, which is when you take a grab of the mud from the seafloor, you sift through it. We have a little lab in the port where we go through it all with a microscope and have a look and identify the species that we might find. It can really help us be a good indicator of like what's going on in that mud. We do all sorts of surveys looking at the other types of fish and marine species you might find, from marine mammals all the way down to, you know, all the tiny little fish that you might find. And what we find is that we have a really, really healthy harbour, which is brilliant. We have kind of a thornback ray kind of nursery ground that's just kind of naturally occurring in the harbour because it's a bit more sheltered, which is lovely to see. We actually also recently found some seahorses in the harbour, which is extremely, extremely rare. So the port's doing all we can to kind of make sure that we're being really good protectors of the marine life. It's also lovely to see that even with such a busy port, we have such a rich marine life found within the port. That's really lovely. We publish all of this information on our website so that anybody can have a look at it and anybody can see for themselves what's there. We also like to share all the pictures because people tend to be quite interested in what's going on. And we've also done some work to kind of better protect the biodiversity and enhance it even in some places. So the port recently did some construction, which we call the Dover Western Docks Revival Project. And it included demolishing an old pier and creating a new one. And one of the things we were a bit concerned about was that by demolishing an old pier, we were losing quite a rich algal community. You know, that pier had been there for a really long time. And the algae was so well established that we were concerned that we knew obviously it would come back on the new pier, but how long is it going to take to get it up to the kind of condition it was in? So we worked with the Environment Agency back in 2018 to produce a special type of formwork that we could set the bricks into to give it a special surface that the algae could adhere to really quickly. And it worked so brilliantly. We had like almost back up to the same levels of algae within 6 months, which was just so fantastic to see that, you know, all of that work with the Environment Agency was successful and it worked really well. We've also done quite a bit of work at projecting different habitats that you find in the port. So Dover's a shingle beach, as are the beaches either side of it, and vegetated shingle is quite a rare habitat. It's a biodiversity action plan habitat. And so we created the wildlife seafront area that we have on Dover Beach, where we are kind of letting natural plants self-seed, and that's been really beneficial for us because we've since found it's called a fiery clearwing moth. It looks more like a wasp than a moth, and it comes out in the day rather than at night. So it's not like a traditional moth, but it's one of the only sightings in the whole of the UK. It's found in our little area of Kent, and we actually have had sightings. We've had the Butterfly Conservation Trust come down and find eggs as well in that area, so we know that the habitat
It's
is doing
there.
exactly what
Yeah.
we wanted it to be doing, which is really brilliant. So we are always looking for opportunities to enhance the marine environment as well as just protect what is already there.
So you're being amazing environmental stewards.
That's our
ultimately,
plan.
at the
That's
Port
our
of Dover.
plan. Yes.
Great to hear. So we don't probably, as from a public perspective, don't really think about ports as being environmental stewards or
Definitely.
green. What would you say to the general public around, the Port of Dover, well, maybe not just the Port of Dover, ports in general, and the impact and the positive impact that they're having from an environmental kind of / sustainability perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of places, a lot of ports are doing kind of the stuff that I've just talked about. We're not the only one doing all of this kind of environmental monitoring and looking at our carbon emissions and all of these things. And in some ways, maybe it's the ports not being the best job at publicising that information because we kind of just get on with the work and we're really happy with it. And I think ports generally need to be better at shouting about all the really cool stuff that we're doing. But I think, it's really easy to look at a port and see it as quite an industrial place. But the maritime industry as a whole is very aware that we need that healthy sea life. We need to move forward. We need to be sustainable to be here in the future. And so really just looking at actually what the port is doing. A lot of ports do share this information. Again, they probably don't shout about where it is enough for you to find it, but you'd be surprised by the kind of things that ports are doing, specifically those kind of like trust ports as well that have such close links with their community. We really are trying to make sure that the port alone isn't improving, but the community as a whole is improving. And I think that's something that ports are actually doing a really good job of, and we all need to just be better at probably talking about it and pinpointing the community to find that information as well.
Amazing. So, Megan, coming to you personally, background in marine biology, now working at the Port of Dover. You've been there for quite a few years now. Think of yourself as a retired Megan, hopefully in early 50s, but most likely 70s. But there we go. When you look back, what impact do you hope to have had?
I think that's kind of why I went into this field. Is when I was younger, I always wanted to do something where I'd go home each day and I'd be like, oh, I made that a little bit better today. I felt like I've made a difference to something other than just myself. And that's kind of what I hope to be. I hope that the port's going to meet all these targets and we're going to really be able to decarbonise such an important route to the UK. 33% of all UK EU trade comes through the Port of Dover. It's a massive part of what the UK needs from that perspective. And I really just hope that we can meet all those targets, and I'm very sure that we can. We've put in a lot of work to make that happen.
Well, you heard it here, right? She said it on the podcast now, so we can hold you to it, Megan.
Yes, and I really want to be able to look back and know that I made a difference, and that we were able to do something so special because, as you mentioned at the beginning, this is really ambitious. We would be one of the first ports to go on this journey, and I think that's really important. If we can show that you can do it at a port as busy as this port, you can do it anywhere. And I really hope that is something that I can look back and be really proud of.
Well, I think that's something that everyone can take forward in industry, right? Like if industries such as a port where it is extremely challenging can make such a change and really drive that change, then there's no excuse for everyone else. So Megan, thank you so much for joining us on Making an Impact. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me. It's been lovely.
More than welcome. Thanks so much.